Hi everyone, thanks for joining me for another video. I love history, I really do. I mean, going into the archives, you just really get to experience, it seems like first-handedly, the things and the conditions that people were living in and under during that time, just how people felt and thought, their daily activities, the politics of the day, the social climate of that time. It was just to be able to experience it from eyewitnesses who were there living through those times. It's just so fascinating for me. And every time I go back into the archives, I find more and more proofs. A lot of people were fighting against and just questioning things that were going on during this time. And so running across this column, of course, I had to, when you see this red, that means that obviously that's the filter when I did my search. But so this column is called Heard and Seen, a column for and from everybody. Okay, and so this guy writes in. Okay, so it's titled, Is the Earth Flat? Dear Bill, we are taught that the Earth is round. We have no way of knowing except to follow what the scientists say. So far as my mundane affairs are concerned, it makes no difference. But I'm getting all balled up about the whole thing. Between reading the declarations of Wilbur Voliva of Zion City that the Earth is positively flat, and W.J. Bryan that we are not descended from apes, I don't know where I stand. Voliva quotes the Bible to show that the Earth is flat, and Bryan relies upon it to prove that Darwin was imbued with imagination. Can't we settle this thing in the old column, the only real form that people have? Just suppose the Earth is flat after all. What are we going to do about it? The thing ought to be settled. There are thousands of cake eaters and flappers all over the world who are living their sweet lives under the impression that the Earth is round. If they are being deceived, it's terrible, that's all. They should know the real truth. Are there not among your contributors many bright minds who will tell us just what the flappers do think on this subject? Signed, Professor X. And that's all that we want to do. As a fellow Bible believer and flat earth proponent, I want to know what the truth is. And I want to know why they won't tell us the truth, because we all deserve that. I mean, we all deserve to know the truth. But that is what the question is of the day, isn't it? Why isn't it settled? Why isn't this thing settled? It should have been settled from the beginning. But because these pseudoscientists, these theoretical, hyper-theoretical scientists came in on the scene, pressured by people who were trying to push astronomy so hard and saying, look at the stars, look at the planets, starting this whole SpaceX type of environment, outer space, outer space, outer space, indoctrination, indoctrination, indoctrination. So rather than it being settled by the Bible, by our eyes, our senses, what we experience, what we actually observe, rather than letting that settle the matter, they wanted to push this agenda of this spinning, hurling ball in a black void of outer space, hurling towards the sun. But as he said, if they are being deceived, it's terrible, that's all. It is terrible. There was a commercial that used to come on years ago it was the United Negro Fund and College Fund, and the message or the ending slogan or whatever, or the message was, a mind is a terrible thing to waste. And to add to that, a mind is a terrible thing to destroy. And when they are perpetuating this lie about, no, well, these lies, I should also include evolution, of course. When they're perpetuating these lies, it does destroy your mind, because I don't care what these atheists say who say, oh, I just love because, I love because I have a heart, and it's good to love, and why not love? You'd have to be crazy not to love. Like, that's just something that naturally occurred. Like, there was some emotion that was interwoven into your DNA that said, okay, you can love now. You have the gene to love. So when we see how the lies help to create this thing that makes people not see God. He's very distant to them, foreign to them, and not even there, okay, for them and to them. And it's been replaced by another God, which is universe, the eternal universe that just naturally set into motion everything that we have today. But this article is just as true today as it ever was. Knowing the truth, we want to know the truth. Truth is better than anything. Truth is the fundamental thing that we should all embrace, seek. We should be searching for truth. All truth, and not stifle it just because we don't want to step on someone's toes or appear to be uneducated or unintelligent or unpopular, because we don't, it's basically gang mentality, doing what the masses want you to do. It's a group thing. Groupthink is very, very strong. It's very powerful. And all of these people have it. They just cannot stop. It's like, okay, the consensus. Well, scientists say, 4 out of 5 scientists. It's just, it constantly is that driving force that causes people to deny just things within themselves. They question, but they have to pretend like, oh, okay, I understand that, I get that. Things that are just so clear. Okay, and here's another one from the Washington Times, dated May 26, 1922. This is just an article. It's about, okay, on getting a hearing, the man with a grievance is a nuisance, the man with a plan is welcome. Grievances annoy other people but fail to interest them. The tone of voice has a faint well in it. Some public reformers make the same mistake as the man with the grievance. The faults they point out are worth noting. The men they snipe are fair game. The failure of these earnest critics lies in the unfailing gloom they carry and spread. They leave all the good tunes to the sinners. They get no fun out of their fights. We do not need a prophet to tell us that some of the conditions of life are sour and hard. Human affairs are more of a quick lunch than a banquet. The earth is an imperfect sphere, slightly flattened at the poles, and in celestial terms it is a third-rate planet at best. But we are on it and cannot get off it. We are in it and cannot get out of it. In suggesting amendments to the common lot, there is needed a genial and hearty note. but of all let the reformers bring a plan instead of a grievance. You see, I mean, it's just like we today have, every commercial has outer space images or globes everywhere, some symbol of, outer space. Everything that they wrote, most of the things that they wrote back then in the newspapers and the magazines had to keep inserting and injecting, okay, outer space, spherical Earth, you're on a ball, you're spinning through space, the Earth is moving, spinning around the sun. I mean, it was constant, just to continue the programming. And then I came across this article. It says, Ape Ancestors Unlawful. The newspapers have made much of the attempts of certain Kentucky legislators to enact a law forbidding the teaching of evolution in the public schools of that state. They noted also that a certain religious enthusiast out in Illinois was contending for the flat earth at the same time that the Kentucky legislators were endeavoring to kill Darwinism. The legislative pronouncements of a democracy must, in the nature of the case, conform more or less to the intellectual status of the people. The average individual does not like to think that his ancestors were simians. It may seem strange that legislative attempts to suppress the teaching of science may succeed in the near future, but it is worthwhile to recall that the ancient Greeks and the Romans knew the earth to be round and even measured it, had correct notions as to the sun and moon, and elaborated a doctrine of evolution as exposited, for example, in the famous poem of Lucretius. As you know, the knowledge was lost for centuries. Yeah, it is a doctrine. It's a doctrine of evolution because that is a religion. It's a religious order. It's a religion. The heliocentric model is a religion. Not just evolution, which comes from that, but the whole, the Big Bang brought out the two lies of evolution and the heliocentric model, that everything was spinning through outer space, hurling around the sun. Heliocentrism and evolution, the bastard children of this model, this doctrine. Okay, something like 2,000 years after the age of Pericles, Galileo was forced to keep quiet about his belief in a moving globe, and Copernicus expounded the true relations of sun and earth only with discretion. Almost 2,000 years after Lucretius, there came, wait for it, the Kentucky legislator. In the light of history, who shall say what may not be supreme 100 years, let alone 2,000 years after Darwin and the teachings of the other 19th century scientists and philosophers? I would just say philosophers. Yeah, the science went out the window when they started to entertain things that could not be observed and tested. Then they started to get philosophical with astronomy and the stars, and they got hypnotized by it and got starstruck somehow, pun intended. And yes, their minds got spaced out. And so then they started looking towards the stars and the moon and the sun to say, oh, okay, well, then I think that means that we're spinning in outer space. Okay, and the next article that I came across, dated November 1st, 1890, is the Earth Flat. A man who expends money and ink to prove that it is. A periodical published to prove the Earth a plane, all modern science declared a humbug, the North Pole as the hub of the universe. The Earth, scripturally, rationally, and practically described. A geographical, philosophical, and educational review, nautical guide, and general student's manual. Such is the all-embracing title of a singular publication that made its first appearance in London on the 4th of September, 1886. I'll start back. From a casual examination, one would never suspect what a ponderous mass of strangely new knowledge is concealed therein, but a closer scrutiny reveals a free use of exclamation points and italics, premonitory flashes, and tremors indicative of giant forces, and pin-up powers impatient of a too long restraint. The original matter is full of strong explosive sentences which have a boom effect that reminds one of the pyrotechnic displayed lately seen here at the numerous destructions of Pompeii. How he lost his money. In March 1870, Mr. Hampton agreed to forfeit £500 to any one who would scientifically demonstrate the curvature of the Earth's surface. This truth once established, he conceded, would prove the truth of the Newtonian theory that the Earth is a globe. Mr. Alfred Russel Wallace accepted this offer and proceeded to carry out his part of the contract. A place known as the Bedford Canal, or level, situated in a marshy district on the eastern coast of England, was chosen as the theater of operation. Referees or judges acceptable to both parties were selected. During the greater part of a week, observations, measurements, and calculations were made by scientific gentlemen of high standing by means of the latest and most perfect instruments and by the most approved methods. The result was that the judges decided against Mr. Hampton and in favor of Mr. Wallace, and concluded the matter by paying over to the latter the stake of £500. Mr. Hampton denounced the whole affair as a fraud and then resorted to vituperation, denunciation, and strong invective. Finally, Mr. Wallace brought suit for libel against Mr. Hampton and won his case. These two defeats left rankling wounds, for in one of the numbers of The Earth, its editor writes, quote, "Is the swindling transaction at a Bedford Canal in 1870 yet obliterated from the memories of Mr. Wallace and his associates? Do they insanely imagine we have either forgotten or forgiven it?" End quote. His vigorous campaign. It seems that for 15 years this doughty controversialist had been unsuccessful in his efforts to induce the scientific societies to listen to an exposition of his theories or to print them in their transactions. Therefore, he concluded to publish a journal of his own in which he could say what he pleased without being beholden to anyone. The first number of The Earth contains a card to our readers in which the editor makes the modest assertion that never since journalism was first introduced has there been a single sheet headed with this title or devoted to the subject we propose to discuss in these columns. A subject, too, which ought to be as familiar to every man, woman, and child in the world as the number and names of the days of the week. As soon as they know their right hand from their left, children should be taught the shape of the earth beneath their feet, and they would know it intuitively were it not for the fictions and fables forced into their minds from a set of Bible-hating and infidel astrologers who lived and wrote in the darkest ages of the world. Some idea of the shape of the earth as Mr. Hampton proposes we should understand it may be had from an advertisement on the 8th page of this first number, where we learn that for one can obtain a copy of a colored map of the world as a circular plane with diagram of corrected latitudes and longitudes. Speaking of this map, he says, there is no other chart that can be compared with it, to which statement few persons will be inclined to take exception. But then he adds, every other map of the world is a frightful and shameful burlesque of the truth, the verity of which assertion just as few will be likely to concede. Hampton's theory. This, in brief, is this cosmographer's theory of the Earth, that it is a great, flat, circular, stationary plane, its inhabitants living only on the upper side of it, that the sun and moon revolve above it at a mean height of about 2,700 miles, and that there is no such thing as solar attraction or gravitation. The continents and seas are arranged about the Arctic region of the center of the Earth plane and spread away toward the outer edge of the disk, the meridians of longitude diverging like the spokes of a wheel from the northern center to the southern circumference. It would be well for the Patagonians and Australians to adopt the precaution to keep a wide-awake seaman up aloft as they go sailing about the southern seas, or they will sail serenely off the face of the earth and go floating everlastingly through the unexplored regions of infinite space. Hilarious. With a few extra blows of his cudgel, this iconoclast demolishes, to his own satisfaction evidently, the principles of magnetism, which he says are as woefully erroneous as are the popularly accepted notions of the ocean's shape and the fact of atmospheric pressure, which he considers as preposterously false and gross a delusion as a spherical earth. Lunar eclipses, too, share a similar fate. In this case, however, he furnishes a substitute for the theory destroyed. He tells us positively that the darkening of the face of the moon is not caused by a shadow of the earth, but is due simply to some non-luminous body passing before our satellite at determinate intervals, and thus he fulminates against a projected expedition to reach the South Pole. Could anyone in their sober senses be so infatuated, so mentally degraded, as to seriously contemplate an expedition to a place which only a set of heathen astrologers invented in an age notorious for its whimsical superstitions? What do geographers know about a South Pole? It will be admitted that Mr. Hampton knows how to propound some stunning questions. Children often do the same. Single-handed in the fight. So, it continues. Mr. Hampton recognizes the fact that he stands almost alone in his contest with the scientific world, and that it is his lot to fight single-handed what he calls a combined host of stupid opposition in the face of existing scorn, ridicule, malice, and ignorance. He asks if, under the circumstances, it can be expected that he will have any great consideration for the feelings of his adversaries, and to show that he would not, he launches forth in this manner. One of the wooden-headed contributors on the editorial staff of the Kensington News has lately been filling 3 or 4 columns every week in his absurd attempt to prove the world a globe by a series of mathematical figures which would have served equally well as an illustration of a new pattern for floor cloth. When Mr. Hampton swings out his right, he doesn't use 5-ounce gloves. All the attempts which have hitherto been made, says he, to establish points of collision or antagonism between the Bible and true science, as they call it, have resulted in failure, but that a real antagonism does exist between revelation and modern theories falsely called science, between the Bible and true science have resulted in failure, but that a real antagonism does exist between revelation and modern theories falsely called science. None will venture to deny, and inasmuch as all modern science is in direct antagonism with the inspired records, all modern science must be a spurious counterfeit and as unworthy of being a standard of reference in determining the truth of the Mosaic records as a butcher's scales would be incapable of weighing diamonds. Some stunning questions. The primary and practical question we have to determine, as Mr. Hampton puts it, is this. On what possible grounds can a surface which to any available extent, even on land, can be proved to be devoid of any approximation to a continuous curve, while on water an absolutely level and horizontal area can alone be discovered by the utmost skill and the most perfect instruments we can employ be called a globe, or any portion of a globe or sphere? Never for a moment has he admitted that the Bedford Canal experiment was anything more than a stupendous piece of scientific jugglery on the part of a lot of designing men. Mr. Hampton is like the 12th juryman who declared that the whole level were again him from the start. We have very reluctantly and very regretfully been forced to conclude, or the conclusion, he writes, that there is no longer any room for doubting that the clergy, the journalists, and professional classes generally have entered upon a determined conspiracy to assist to the utmost all discussion and exposure of the pagan blasphemy of Sir Isaac Newton's globular theory. And these blundering craftsmen, with their specious effrontery, have actually silenced the too timid defender of biblical truth, so that the very men who naturally shrank from exposing the weakness of the only authority they had for occupying the positions, they did yielded submission to these braggart geologists and tamely acquiesced in all the blasphemy they uttered. The biblical theory. We claim no originality, says this ascetic philosopher, for the announcement that this earth is a circular and motionless plane instead of a revolving ball. This was regarded as a broad, palpable, indisputable, and well-established fact during the first 5,000 years, and the impious and impudent attempts to improve upon or supplant the inspired teaching of the sacred historians by the whimsical fictions of the heathen astrologers is all that we are engaged in denouncing. We cannot admit that Newton's solar system of globular theory is partly true and partly false, but we most emphatically declare and are prepared to prove that it does not contain one single particle of truth from the first line to the last. The globular theory is very only extravagant and unphilosophical, irrational and absurd, dependent on laws which have never existed, and is supported only by bigots who have never ventured to appeal to actual facts to illustrate or enforce their too learned pretensions. whereas the indisputable proofs of the world being a stationary plane are so numerous and so overwhelming and so palpable as to convince every honest inquirer. Children at play may indulge in fanciful conjectures, but practical men should not submit to such baseless superstitions as to believe that their ships are ever sailing upside down to the docks from whence they started. Shades of Galileo, Kepler, and Newton, what grinding torments must their departed spirits endure, if such utterance as these are ever borne in upon their consciousness to disturb their deliberations, as they meet upon the bank of some limpid stream flowing through the Elysian fields, to discuss the deep problems that once so perplexed them, but which they must now so easily comprehend. In 1877, Mr. Hampden published a little brochure. In the first place, all the usually accepted maps of the world, both those showing two hemispheres and Mercator's rectilinear projections, all models representing the Earth as a globe, and all our geographies must be discarded as being in every respect erroneous and utterly misleading. All our acquired knowledge or learning on this subject must be unlearned and relegated to the limbo of rejected theories. Wow, this is just so true. The Earth and the stars. The Earth rests on actual foundations, which the Scripture declare are past finding out. It is not merely suspended in space, but is supported by some sort of substantial base underneath it. The sun, moon, and stars are self-luminous and imponderable gases and float upon an atmosphere denser than themselves. The stars are hardly bigger than the gas jets which light our streets, and if they could be made to change places with them, no astronomer could detect the difference. If every star in the firmament were to fall into the sea tomorrow, we should miss them just as much as no more than we should the daisy on our lawn. This is an illustration of that. The sun, moon, stars, and flat, round, plane. Disk. Okay. That's what he was referring to. The points of latitude and longitude. The frozen north is the hub of the world, and the southern ice rim is therefore the uttermost boundary of the earth and its waters, and is about 32,000 miles in circumference. If two vessels should set out from Cape Horn, one sailing in a southeasterly and the other in a southwesterly course, they would never meet again round a point or pole due south of both, but would touch the ice border at widely distant points. East and west are relative terms and always imply a circular direction, while the expressions north and south always indicate a right line. A right line. Let's go and look at this. The sun's revolutions. The sun revolves above the earth at the height of about 2,700 miles in a plane parallel to the surface of the level earth. Its orbit is concentric and spiral. During 6 months, its spiral course decreases as it nears the June solstice and increases to its greatest dimensions during the remaining 6 months as it approaches the December solstice, traveling with greater rapidity from June to December. As each successive day increases the length of the radius vector of its orbit and at a constantly decreasing rate of speed in its journey northward from December to June. The increased rapidity of the sun's motion in the southern portion of its course causes a much greater degree of cold in the regions south of the equator. It makes 2.5 concentric revolutions before resuming its spiral journey from either solstitial points. Its mean annual course lies directly above the equator. At the summer solstice, when it makes its most northern circuit, its path reaches about 1,200 miles north of the equator, and at the winter solstice, it extends an equal distance south. The circumference of the sun's orbit at the June solstice is 16,200, and it travels at the rate of 562.5 miles an hour. Over the equator in March and September, its orbit is 21,600 miles, and its speed 900 miles an hour. At the December solstice, its orbit is 27,300 miles, and its rate 1,237.5 miles an hour. The sun, of course, makes its circuits from east to west in 24 hours. As it nears our meridian, we have daylight, and those on the opposite meridian are left in darkness. Then, passing on its course, the many thousand miles of vapors and clouds in the atmosphere obscure its rays till the dawn of another day. The moon is nearer to us than the sun, one hemisphere being light, its own light, not a reflected one, and the other dark. The stars also have their own light. The sun may shine on them, but their light is entirely independent of the sun's luminosity. Not a case of gravity. The surface of all water under the heavens is a dead level. Attraction does not act on water. Rivers do not flow downhill on their way to the sea. Their waters are carried forward by the accumulation of the waters behind, and when, as is generally the case, their sources are above the level of the sea, they descend by sudden falls or rapids until they again reach a lower level course. The moon has no more effect upon the tides than upon the ebb and flow of the blood in our veins. How they are caused may be discovered when we grow wiser. Mr. Hampton is perfectly sincere in his belief in the absolute correctness of his theory of the earth, and would no doubt be willing to say with Milton, "If this fail, the pillared firmament is rottenness, and earth's base built on stubble." Okay, this other article from the Washington Times, dated December 11th, 1921, teaching school children that the earth is flat. The guiding head of the Zion colony explains why scientists are all wrong in their ideas of geography and astronomy. The sun is smaller than the earth, which stands still, and the sun revolves around it while the moon takes its own light. These are the claims of the flat earth, which coincides with what we actually observe. This is a model showing the firmament, and it shows all the heavenly bodies inside of it. The sun, the moon, the stars, and the planets. Up here, these are the waters above the earth. You wonder why the sky is blue? Well, according to this, because there's water above us, above the firmament. And these are the winds blowing, the east and west winds. The windows of heaven. So when there was the great flood, the worldwide flood, yeah, he opened the windows of heaven, and the windows of heaven are found up here. And doesn't it make more sense for there to be a flood on a flat earth than on a round spinning ball hurling through a vacuum? Underneath the flat earth, in the center, is hell. I wonder why in the heliocentric model they have as the center a molten iron core, extremely hot. Maybe it's a depiction, yeah, of hell, or Hades without saying. Yeah, hell is underneath, it's in the belly of the earth, as the Bible says. Some ugly creatures down here, but Leviathan, okay, so Leviathan. You know, the Bible talks about Leviathan as well. Rahab and Leviathan, sea monsters. Hell is a real place, whether people want to believe it or not, and it was not intended for any person, any human being to go there. Hell was for the devil, Satan, and the fallen angels, the ones who rebelled when they were in heaven. Not for mankind. But people choose to go there by not accepting Jesus' free gift of salvation, believing on him, believing that he died for our sins and he rose on the third day with all power. Bodily, he rose. Okay, that he came to earth, he was born, he lived his life as a human, he was a teacher, and he was a leader, and he taught people that the Father was in heaven, and the Father is in heaven, and that we were created in his image, and that the Father loves us so much, and that we were created to worship him, and that he wants our lives to be abundant and joyful, and he wants to be providing for us and give us provisions. But people reject that when something goes bad. The old map of the earth showing its flat surface fenced around on the outer edge by mountain ranges which held up the sky. The sky was a circle of metal, and there were doors in the heaven where celestial workers poured rain and blew the winds. And the center of the earth was a dark pit, Hades, where the wicked went after death. So the article, okay, so it says 1,000 children in the schools of Zion, Illinois, are being taught in their geography classes that the earth is flat. It is so ordered by Wilbur Glenn Voliva, who is spiritual and temporal boss of Zion and incidentally superintendent of the town's schools. The teaching prescribed by him is that the earth is circular, like a pancake, the North Pole marking its center. There is no South Pole. All around the edge of the terrestrial disk is a wall of ice, a turned-up rim, so to speak, put there for the purpose of preventing two adventurous mariners from falling off into the void of space. This Earth disk on which we dwell is stationary and immovable. The theory that the Earth travels around the Sun is a wild notion propagated by astronomers and other dreamers. Wish upon a star. These people are really into imagination and fables, dream-like state they're living in. Unlike a pancake, the Earth disk is very thick in proportion to its diameter. We cannot know, of course, how thick it is because we have never bored into it much beyond a mile. The increase of temperature with depth, however, proves that it must be very hot down below. And further evidence of a really tremendous heat is given by frequent outpourings of molten rocks from volcanoes. Far beneath us, this is what Mr. Voliva calls the hot place. Folks who do not agree with his teachings are liable to find their way thither later on. But the hot place is of very essential importance to us while we are pursuing our present-day existence because it maintains the fires of the sun. This seems rather surprising, but is easily explained. The sun, which circles every 24 hours around the Earth, as anybody can see for himself, passes during each night through a large hole or tunnel that extends horizontally clear through the terrestrial disk down below us. Deluded astronomers declare that the solar orb is more than 1,000,000 times as big as the Earth. Plain foolishness. As a matter of fact, it is only 32 miles in diameter, and instead of being 93 million miles off, its distance from us is slightly less than that which separates New York from San Francisco, 2,700 miles to be exact, according to Mr. Voliva. It is obvious that a sun of that size would soon burn out unless its fires were constantly resupplied, and it is for that very purpose that our celestial luminary makes a nightly journey through the aforementioned tunnel, which passes through the hot place. Thus recruited every 24 hours, its blazes continue undimmed. A matter of everyday observation is the redness of the sun when it rises or sets. This phenomenon is attributable to the fact that at such times, the solar orb, ascending above or descending below the edge of the Earth disk, reflects the mighty fires that continually emerge from the east and west ends of the great tunnel. The sun is not so much bigger than the moon as it looks. The moon is farther off, and the radius of its revolution being greater, it passes beneath the Earth disk, avoiding the tunnel that penetrates the hot place. While the Earth remains stationary, being the center of creation, everything else moves around it. The firmament of stars is a revolving sphere. If we watch, we can see it go around. The planets are wandering stars. All the other stars are permanently set and fixed. And the firmament. Sun and moon are properly to be regarded as the greatest of the planets. Compared with them, the stars are insignificant orbs in point of size, mere lanterns hung in the sky. The moon is the greatest light giver next to the sun. It is self-luminous, not a mere reflector of the sun's rays, but a light. All the lights in the sky are put there solely to illuminate the earth, to divide day from night, and to serve as signs for years and seasons. The sun does not shed light and heat in all directions, wasting its energy upon the void of space. It throws all of its rays toward the earth like a lamp with a reflector behind it. Heavens and the earth were created first, and the lights afterward. The lights being brought into being merely for the use of the earth are inferior to the latter in size. To suppose that the sun is bigger than the earth is an absurdity, says Mr. Voliva. A small lamp or stove will light or heat a large room. The idea of making a light so enormously larger than the object to be lighted and then placing it at an unthinkable distance from that object is preposterous. Scripture testimony regarding the movements of the sun and moon is supported by the evidence of vision. All except the blind can see the sun and moon move. Bible astronomy, says Mr. Voliva, teaches the immobility of the earth and the movement of the lights above us, and is the only astronomy a Christian should believe. Modern astronomy, says Mr. Voliva, is infidel science. So much for the general arrangement of the cosmos. Now let us go back to the flat Earth and see how Mr. Voliva proves his pancake proposition. The habitable world of dry land, he says, stands out of the waters of the mighty deep, whose circumferential boundary is a wall of ice. Start from any geographical point in America, Europe, Asia, wherever you please, and travel directly south. Keep on going south, and eventually you reach that ice wall. The wall is there. Testimony of all Antarctic voyagers proves it. Teachers of science, falsely so called, declare that the sphericity of the Earth is demonstrated by the fact that ships have sailed around it. What does that amount to? One can circumnavigate Manhattan Island. Is it therefore a sphere? The assertion that ships have sailed around the world on one course, east or west, and come back to the place they started from is untrue. Whole continents are in the way. The ships would have had to sail thousands of miles over dry land. The Earth can be circumnavigated on one course only through the waters of the great Southern Ocean, which occupy all of the outer part of the disk, terminated by the surrounding ice wall. Such an expedition, however, would be highly perilous, owing to icebergs and darkness that lasts for half the year. Such a voyage would not prove the Earth to be a sphere. The ship would merely circle a plane. Obviously, a flat disk can be circumnavigated. An east or west course pursued on a flat circle will bring the traveler back to his starting point. If a donkey be tied to a stake on a flat common, he walks around the stake in pursuit of grass. But the path he travels is a circle. It has no relation to a sphere. Another proof of the Earth's sphericity, offered by teachers of so-called science, is that a ship sailing into the distance disappears gradually below the horizon, first the hull, and then the masts, as if sinking behind a hill of water. Mr. Voliva says that this is purely an optical illusion. Look at the horizon from the seashore. It is a perfectly straight line, not an arched curve, as it would be if the Earth were spherical. Water in a cup, in a wash basin, in a lake, or in an ocean is flat, whether for a distance of 1 foot or for 1,000 miles. Astronomers ought surely to know that water is level. In cutting canals, no allowance is made for convexity of the Earth. The engineers who dug the Suez ditch 100 miles long made no such allowance. There are no locks on the Grand Canal in China, which is more than 700 miles in length. It runs through flat country. Locks are used for the Panama Canal only because there are land elevations to be crossed with the lake above the level of the sea. The Caribbean and Pacific ends of that canal are on the same plane, which is sea level. What does the Earth look like when one goes up in a balloon? Seen from a height of miles with a view extending over a vast area, it would offer to the eye at least a suggestion of the globular, if it were really a sphere. But ask any balloonist, and he will tell you that the landscape thus viewed has actually a dished effect, the horizon on all sides seeming to rise with the balloon. If you look up the words sun, moon, stars, waters, etc. in a Bible concordance and then refer to the passages indicated, you will be surprised to find how much of astronomy there is in holy writings. A familiar passage is that in Joshua commands the sun to stand still, and it obeys him. Certainly it could not have stood still if the earth curved around it. I think that's curved. It's a little cut off. If the Earth were, as the astronomers assert, a globe flying through space at a rate of 100 miles in 5 seconds, none of the waters of the lakes and seas would be kept on its surface. The astronomers, for evidence, a lot of this is unfortunately cut off. The astronomers, for evidence, the correctness of their theories point to the accuracy with which they are able to predict eclipses. It is no proof. Ancient I guess, stargazers who believe the Earth to be flat could and did predict eclipses 600 years in advance. Eclipses are not calculated in connection with the Earth shape. Up to the 16th century, it is accepted as fact that the Earth was immovable, center of the universe, and that the sun, moon, and stars revolved around it. Then Copernicus promulgated his famous theory that the Earth and the planets revolved around the sun. Offered proof of it, but it was rejected contrary to scripture. Copernicus, declared to be an atheist and infidel under pressure, practically recanted this doctrine. Later on, it will be, I guess it was I don't know, but it came back on the scene with Galileo, who summoned before the Inquisition, escaped death only by confessing his astronomical ideas to be wrong. I can't really read the rest. In the early medieval cosmography, Earth was a big circular disk in the center of a sea, limitless in all directions between its upper and lower surfaces, a closed cavern of vast size. Yeah, it's hard to read the rest of it, but I will give you the link so that you can read the rest for yourself. Okay, we'll just read this one last paragraph. Oliva's idea of the ice rim of the Earth disk is not original either. He gets it from an earlier authority, Johnson. Does not mention it. He writes, at the extreme south, we come to where Earth and sky join together like the lid and rim of a watch. The air between the face of the Earth and the sky, helped perhaps by volcanic gases, holds the Earth afloat in space. The sun, moon, and stars are between the face of the Earth and the sky. The seas, which are level, all join together. From that, or from what has gone before, it will be understood that, according to the Voliva-Johnson conception, all paths pointing south lead to the rim of the Earth disk. If one were at the North Pole, one might start in any direction, and if he kept on long enough, and a straight line would fetch up at the Earth's rim. According to that conception, the place of the South Pole is taken by the rim, which is the outermost circumference of the pancake-like Earth. That rim hems in the waters of the Great Southern Ocean, which occupies all the outer portion of the Earth platter, the continents of land being in the middle. But yeah, this all makes perfect sense. It just makes common sense. First of all, it proves what we see. We observe this all the time, but we have been fed lies and indoctrinated for so long that it is hard in the beginning to accept this as truth, that the Earth is flat. But when you really think about the model of the heliocentric Earth, and know how impossible that would be without some magic happening, or just forces that will be so intense that we would not literally be able to inhabit this Earth. But God made the Earth inhabitable for us. And just imagine if you had, your fish in a tank that spun around all the time, or terrarium that was hurling, across the room. That would not be very inhabitable for your pets, for your animals. So God, who loves us more than we love ourselves, loves us more than our families. He made this Earth inhabitable for us to provide us with everything that we need, and we do not need to be spinning for Him to keep His eye on us. If anything, isn't it common sense? I'm talking common sense and logic here. Better to keep your eye on something when it's still and not moving and you're right above it, looking down on it. Okay, so just consider these things today, as I always ask for you to research this for yourself, and prove this wrong, and then ask yourself, well, can I prove that the Earth is a globe? Can I prove that there is curvature? Go out and do your own experiments. I mean, I've done mine. I want to get a laser so that I can, I mean, but so many people have done it before, but that's not an excuse. Do your own experiments, test it as much as you can, perspective, and keep all those things in mind when you're doing your experiments, and with an open mind. You know, you have to be open to this and not just think, oh, well, I'm not gonna do this because it's against science. Science, it's not science. You know, these things are not science when it comes to theories. These people are giving you theories as fact, and they've been able to get away with it for, as we see, hundreds of years. They've been able to do this. So collectively, or even thousands to some degree, yeah, with the models. So hopefully we will be able to together come to the truth and come into the full knowledge, because as the writer, Professor X, wrote in, we all deserve to know the truth. Well, until the next time, thank you for joining me. Please write your comments below, and I will be seeing you very soon, I pray. Take care.